Channel open. Welcome back to WeeklyTrek, a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions podcast network. I am your host, Alex Perry.
What's today's date? The date.
Today's show was recorded on March 20th, 2020, and is current through the Star Trek Picard episode Et in Arcadia Ego, Part 1, so beware of spoilers. Alright, let's get into the show.
Good day, Voyager, and welcome to A Briefing with Neelix. It's a catchy title, isn't it?
WeeklyTrek is a 30-minute news show covering the biggest stories from the Star Trek franchise. We are in a new golden age of Star Trek. There are 5 television shows in production, possibly more on the way, and enough merchandise to fill the Bajoran wormhole. So stick with me and I'll help you sort the real facts from a lot of the Dominion propaganda that you'll find online. But I can't do this alone, and my guest this week is the host of the TrekProfiles Podcast. It's John Krikorian. John, welcome to WeeklyTrek. Or I guess, welcome back to WeeklyTrek because you were one of the members of WeeklyTrek, the original series.
That's right. It's like I'm doing the William Shatner coming back on Generations, right? It's just how that works. But what a thrill.
John, give yourself more credit. It's like Leonard Nimoy in Unification.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there you go. You set me right on that, Alex. But what a thrill to be back on, and what a thrill to record with you. It's been forever and a day since we've had a chance to talk, and it was really a thrill for me to come on and be able to reconnect with you for a few minutes. I know we talk on Twitter and on the social medias and all of that, but what a delight to talk about the really exciting news of the week. So I'm jazzed and ready.
All right, John. Well, you know the drill. I want to know something that's got you feeling excited about Star Trek at the moment. What's got you moving at Warp 10?
Yeah, absolutely. This might be the most meta concept I could possibly think of, but
all right.
We all know that IDIC is a big Star Trek concept going right back to the 60s show, and it occurred to me the other day that that's actually what we're seeing in this new Star Trek renaissance that we're living through today, in that we have not just shows in production, but many different kinds of shows. And the beautiful thing about that is that, you know, if someone out there is not excited about Discovery, maybe they like Picard. If they don't like Discovery, they don't like Picard, maybe they'll like Lower Decks. If they don't like those 3 shows, maybe they'll like some of the unnamed other shows in production. So if people are open, there is literally something for everyone in Star Trek these days. And I think that is glorious, wonderful, and it's a little meta example of IDIC in practice. And it's got me excited and moving at Warp 10.
I love that. And I think the current sort of Alex Kurtzman, Heather Caden et al. Have done a really good job, I think, of reflecting on what caused the death of Star Trek in 2005. You came to the end of Enterprise that had come after Deep Space Nine, after Voyager, and there just was this really strong sense of franchise fatigue that went along with that. And I think a big part of that was because a lot of fans, not me, because I could have kept watching it forever, but a lot of fans were feeling like they'd seen everything already, that the sort of formula of the Berman era of Star Trek had sort of run its course, and that there wasn't really anything new or interesting that they could sort of throw out there and do. And that with this new crop of shows, you know, you hear a lot people being like, oh, be careful, because, you know, this is what happened to Star Trek last time. There was too much, and it became too much for people, and they tuned out and turned off. And I don't think it's the intent of Kurtzman and the other producers and the production teams of all of the shows to necessarily want for you to watch every single one of them. Obviously, they know there's the hardcore audience like probably you and me who will do that, but then they're also looking to create shows for different kinds of people to respond to them in different kinds of ways. And with 800 hours of Star Trek already in existence, why not, right? If you're going to make 10 hours of something that appeals to a different kind of audience that might not be for a subset of people who like that existing hundreds of hours worth of television, then it's fun to see them experiment.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons I'm excited for Lower Decks, for instance, is because I was in the Navy and I was on just a regular old ship. I wasn't on a flagship or anything like that. And so it's a chance for me to see someone who might be like me in Starfleet, you know, just some regular guy doing a regular job. So I think that's exciting for me to see. And I hope that there's enough in there to hold my attention. I'm sure there will be. And I think I'm also going to be excited to watch with my kid, because I think he might enjoy that. He's the right age for that. So it's a wonderful, glorious Star Trek renaissance, and I couldn't be more excited about it.
Well, I don't think it's going to be too long until we find out more about what's coming next after the season finale of Star Trek Picard, which is now only a week away. And the thing that I'm feeling good about Star Trek this week is actually a moment from this week's first part of the season finale. I'll be honest, I had my issues with the episode as a whole. It's probably one of my least favorite of the Star Trek Picard season to date, but there was one moment that did get my fanboy heart a-tingling, and that was the moment where they are on the Borg cube and you get this shot of Seven and the full Voyager theme starts playing as part of the musical score. In her previous appearances in episode 4 and episode 5, Jeff Russo's score had sort of played kind of just very, very brief clips of the Voyager theme, but not the sort of main riff part where everybody would go, that's the Voyager theme. And so to finally kind of get that after 4 episodes of seeing this character story was just one of those kind of total, amazingly well done fan servicey moments that is when fan service is done right.
I would have wagered money on 2 other options instead, so you surprised me there, Alex, and good on you for that. I would have thought that you would have suggested either the moment that the Borg cube popped out of the transwarp conduit, or when we see Seven doing her traditional 7 of 9 stance towards the latter part of her appearance in the episode.
Well, I think when she does the stance, that's when the music starts playing too.
Okay.
The two are paired together.
Gotcha.
All right. Well, with that, let's turn to the week's top stories.
There's a war going on, and I'm a reporter.
So our first story this week is an announcement that short treks are on their way to home media. On June 2nd in the US, we are expecting a release of short treks on Blu Ray and DVD. They collect all of the existing short treks except Children of Mars, which I think is probably to be expected on the Star Trek Picard Season 1 Blu Ray. Included on the set are Runaway, Calypso, The Brightest Star, The Escape Artist, Q&A, The Trouble with Edward, Ask Not, Ephraim and Dot, and The Girl Who Made the Stars. And in addition to the short treks themselves, the disc also contains a number of bonus features. It actually includes what I would imagine are relatively short making-ofs featurette for each of the short trek episodes, as well as a making-of featurette for the entire set of short treks as a whole, and audio commentaries for Runaway and Ask Not. While the official press release for the release of short treks does not mention international release, I would anticipate that there will be an international release of the short treks set in the same way that there was for Star Trek Discovery Season 1 and 2 on Blu-ray. And so for folks outside of the US, this actually might be the first way that you get to see the Season 2 short treks, which so far have not shown up on either Netflix or Amazon Prime in the rest of the world. John, do you think you'll be adding the short treks Blu-ray to your collection?
100% guaranteed. I am someone who chooses to buy all the Blu-rays. I don't really buy DVD sets anymore, so that's why I haven't purchased DS9 or Voyager, so I don't have those on disc. But anything that's on Blu-ray, I've purchased, and I love it. And as I was looking at the rundown of what was on this, I have to say, it looks to me as if there is more bonus content than actual show content on the Blu-ray. I mean, it really is an extensive amount of content, considering, like, Ask Not was, 9 minutes? How long can the making of be, right? I bet they made a 20-minute video about the making of the 9-minute short trek. And so I'm going to get it, and I'm going to watch all those, and I'm going to enjoy it. Which, by the way, as podcasters, we can all appreciate the fact that we can talk for 2 hours about a 45-minute episode. So I don't think there's going to be any problem in having an extensive amount of bonus content. But the one thing I do want to say is the one I'm most looking forward to, because I did read the list of the bonus material very carefully, is there's a making of short treks that's supposed to be an in-depth discussion with Kurtzman about the concept of the short treks. And I'm very interested in hearing that, because I have my own theories about why they're doing certain things in short treks or not. And I'm curious to see if I'm off base or not. So I'm really excited about that one, and I definitely will be buying it.
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear them reflect upon the short treks experience. I'm hoping that the release of this set of short treks does not mean that we are not going to get any more of them, because I actually really like the format and I would really like them to do more of them. They are in some ways a bit of a mixed bag. There are ones that people really like, there are ones that people are much colder to, but it's funny, they, I think, ask people what their favorite short treks are, and you'll get very different answers from everybody. They are very experimental. They do allow the franchise to try new things, but in sort of a low risk kind of way where, it's only 10 minutes, it's only 15 minutes long. So, you can try something, and if the audience doesn't respond to it, that's okay. Like The Trouble with Edward, for example, was, I think, a really aggressive experiment into avant-garde humor. And it was something that created a lot of very strong reactions amongst the fan base. For some people, it was very positive reactions. For some people, it was very negative. But it was a really interesting experiment in sort of how far can you push the humor boundary into that kind of humor in the Star Trek franchise, and does it still hold together? And it's fun to see them kind of play out those experiments in that format rather than doing it in one of the main shows where it's potentially much more dangerous.
I mean, the triple breakfast cereal, that'll haunt me for forever, Alex.
We're pregnant with flavor. So our second story this week turns from Star Trek short treks to Star Trek Picard, and the news that Marc Bernardin, writer and podcaster, most famous as co-host of Fat Man Beyond with Kevin Smith, has joined Star Trek Picard as a supervising producer. Marc has had a storied career as a writer, and he previously wrote on the Sci-Fi Channel's Alphas, and currently writes for Hulu's Castle Rock, and has also written on USA's Treadstone and Carnival Row on Amazon Prime. He actually has a long time ago association with the Star Trek franchise, both as a fan and as an intern, where he was an intern on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. So this is quite the sort of circle of career being complete for Marc, but he, in an Instagram post where he announced that he was joining the production team for Star Trek Picard, he actually indicated that his history with the franchise goes back even further. He wrote, "When I was in my junior year of college, a film professor pointed me to a screenwriting contest for undergrads and suggested that I enter. The lone requirement was you had to write a spec episode of a currently airing TV show. At the time, I didn't watch a ton of TV. I was a nerd, and back in the early 90s, there weren't a lot of options. But there was one show I loved and knew inside out, so I wrote an episode of that one. It was Star Trek The Next Generation. And it was the very first time I wrote words that were coming out of existing characters' mouths, the first thing that looked anything like a screenplay. So I wrote a TNG episode and won the contest. It took a long time for me to fulfill the promise of that very early career victory, but here we are. Today was my first day as a supervising producer on Star Trek Picard. All good things come to those who wait." John, I know you are a fan of Marc himself, but it warms my heart anytime a longtime Star Trek fan manages to realize their dream of working on the show. This is very exciting, don't you think?
Oh, it is absolutely exciting. And I first became aware of Marc, actually, when Sci-Fi Wire announced that they were bringing a podcast out called the Battlestar Galacticast, which is a rewatch or watch-along type podcast. So if the Star Trek fans out there are familiar with Mission Log, it's sort of a show like that, where they talk about each episode and avoid spoilers in the future and sort of go through each episode and talk about it. And it's Marc and Tricia Helfer, who is the number 6 character, right? So yeah, people who've never even seen the show, they in the reboot, they see that woman in the red dress, right? That's the woman in the red dress. And you don't listen to 30, 40 hours of content of someone without getting to know them a little bit. And I think as podcasters, Alex, you've experienced this too, where you put out this content and people feel like they understand you a little bit from the words coming out of your mouth and being in their ears, and they feel like they understand you a little bit.
Sure, it fills me with dread.
Yeah. When you stare into the abyss also stares into you. And so I feel like I've gotten a little bit of an understanding of Marc, and I've engaged with him on Twitter a few times, and he's always been so generous and kind to respond to tweets and things like that. I mean, I'm sure it's going to blow up now that he's getting into Star Trek, but he is a regular guy who is a nerd and a fan, and he is someone who is in the club. This is not some professional writer type who, was writing detective novels and then wrote, historical fiction, and then they put him in charge of Star Trek, right? This is someone who is steeped in comics, steeped in fandom. He is one of us, and he's getting to work on the show. So not only do I feel like he will bring a interesting perspective to the show, I feel like he's also an incredible talent, and I feel like we can all live vicariously through him as well, because it's one of us getting into the big leagues. There is absolutely no downside to this, and all props to Marc, and I am rooting for him, and I think we all should. And I cannot wait to see what kind of imprimatur he puts on the next season of Star Trek Picard, because it is going to be absolutely glorious. Of that, I have no doubt.
I think the best Star Trek writers' rooms are ones that are stocked with a combination of two different kinds of writers. Writers who understand good storytelling, but are not as steeped in the universe in which they're writing. And then on the other side, writers who get Star Trek. And I think it is in the tension between those two types of writers and the talent of those two types of writers that amazing Star Trek stories are told. And so it always fills me with joy anytime a well-established Star Trek fan who gets it, like Marc, like Kirsten Beyer, ends up in the writer's room for one of these shows, because it means that the side of the ledger that really understands the universe and really understands what the people who invest so much of their time, energy, and frankly money into that universe want, it ultimately makes the product even better. So this is thrilling as far as I'm concerned.
I completely agree, and I just can't wait to see what's happening. Now, if I do understand the news correctly, he's going to be what's called a supervising producer.
Yes.
And that to me sounds like a producer who actually does something on the show, as opposed to many other producers who are just attached for contractual reasons. So another reason to just be excited.
All right, so our third story this week. Last week we did our William Shatner thinks he's done with Captain Kirk story. This week we're doing Simon Pegg thinks he's done with Scotty, and that the whole Kelvin Timeline cast is probably done with Star Trek. In an interview with Games Radar, Simon Pegg threw cold water on the idea of a Star Trek 4 that featured the Kelvin Timeline crew. He said, "The fact is, Star Trek movies don't make Marvel money. They make maybe $500 million at most, and to make one now, on the scale they've set themselves is $200 million. You have to make 3 times that to make a profit. I don't feel like the last one, they didn't really take advantage of the 50th anniversary. The regime at the time dropped the ball on promo of the film, and we've lost momentum. I think losing Anton Yelchin was a huge blow to our little family, and our enthusiasm to do another one might have been affected by that. So I don't know." So he's not totally closing the door on the idea of the Kelvin Timeline crew reappearing, but it does sound in some ways like Paramount might have also moved on from that crew, and in which case it would be a mutual parting of the ways, given that Noah Hawley has been tapped to write a new Star Trek movie, and when asked about whether it would feature the Kelvin Timeline crew, he was extremely evasive and even implied that, he was interested in going in a different direction. John, would you be disappointed if we didn't see any more movies with the Kelvin Timeline crew, or are you happy with the 3 that we got to date?
Well, I'll say that I'm always for more Star Trek of whatever kind, but I will also say, and I feel like I have to do a little bit of throat clearing, I am someone who is enraptured and very much loves the TOS era movies, especially motion picture, which I talk about incessantly and people tell me to hush about it, but I love all of them very much. But also, I think it's important to remember that at the time that most of the Trek movies were made, from the early 80s right up through the 90s, that television had a lot of constraints. And the thing about 2020, as we sit here and record this, is what do they need to actually make a motion picture for? What can't they do on their streaming service that they have now? It used to be about budget. They can make anything they want to make right now on their streaming service. They can have whatever kind of effects. They can tell stories which have the luxury of a much longer running time than they could ever tell in a movie, even in a 3-hour movie, right? I mean, we're looking at the first season of Picard is essentially, if you back out the exact running time, it's probably going to be something like 8.5, 9 hours worth of content straight through, once you take out the previouslys and the opening credits and the fact that they all don't run for 60 minutes. So what couldn't they do right now on their streaming service? What do they need a movie for? And it's a question that I honestly couldn't come up with an answer. And maybe I'm wrong, and maybe there is a purpose out there. And if people want to tweet at me, I'm more than happy to be proved wrong about it. But the only downside is I did enjoy some of those characters and some of those actors, and I'm sorry that we're not going to see them again. But as far as broader Star Trek goes, it doesn't bother me, because I think the future is very bright, and they can tell any kind of story they want to tell with any kind of look in any kind of format. that right now today, and they don't need to go to a motion picture for that. So I'm a little bit conflicted, but overall, the future is bright.
Yeah, I think compare and contrast, 1998, you had Star Trek First Contact on our screens, and we got a major space battle against a Borg cube that was more technologically sophisticated and much better effects than we had seen at any point on televised Star Trek to date. An attempt to do the same only a year and a half earlier with The Way of the Warrior, the opening 2-part episode from season 4 of Deep Space Nine, had a major space battle. You put those two next to each other, you can tell which one was the movie and which one was the television. Now, take 2016 Star Trek Beyond and the destruction of the Enterprise sequence, and take some of the space battle sequences from Such Sweet Sorrow Part 2, the Season 2 Discovery finale, put those next to each other. Which is the movie and which is the television? I mean, the effects are the same in terms of the level of quality, in terms of the level of, frankly, what looks like money has been put into them. So I think you're absolutely right. It used to be the case that Star Trek movies were a canvas on which you could do bigger things and bolder things that you couldn't do on television, and that's really not the case anymore. And so they do, I think, have to really think hard about what is a Star Trek movie in 2020 when you have things like Picard and Discovery that are doing such amazing things with the effects work and the scale of the story and the scope of the story as it is. And I think maybe it is time to try something new, because just sort of upping the spectacle level over and over again, there's not a whole amount more spectacle you could even get to at this point, given the high level of the Star Trek TV productions.
Right, and the other element, too, is that from the writing side, it gave them an opportunity to write bigger and bolder stories, as you say, that they couldn't do in the constraints of an episodic TV show of 44 minutes that had to go out over syndication, and movies sort of freed them up a little bit creatively. But again, it's a streaming service. They can literally do anything they want. And so I think just they could make movies of the week if they wanted to and put them on the streaming service. They really do have that opportunity if that's something they really wanted to do. I don't see that in the cards, but it's something they could do if they wanted to. So while I'm sad to see fans like Simon Pegg not be able to reprise that role again, which I thought he was a fantastic Scotty, and Chris Pine and Zach Quinto and all of them, I'm not at all worried about the future of Star Trek. I think it's great. Whereas a long time ago, if there weren't movies coming out, we didn't have anything else. But that's not the world we're in today, Alex.
That's absolutely right. Well, our last story this week is a tie back to 2 weeks ago when Ron Roble gave us his theory for who the big guest announcement for Star Trek Las Vegas this year would be, and we now know who that guest is. Creation Entertainment have announced that no, I'm sorry, it will not be Michelle Yeoh, nor will it be Chris Pine, but Kelsey Grammer will be appearing at Star Trek Las Vegas this year, the actor famous for playing Frasier in both Cheers and the eponymous Frasier, had a cameo role as Captain Morgan Bateson in the 5th season Next Generation episode Cause and Effect, a favorite episode for many fans. Grammer will be appearing on stage, he will sign autographs, and he will take pictures with fans on Saturday of the convention. Since we are talking about conventions, and everybody knows that conventions are currently mostly cancelled around the world as a result of the spread of coronavirus, it is important to note that STLV at this point is 18 weeks away from when we record. That is over 4 months, and there is a lot that will change between now and then. Creation Entertainment have put out a message to customers indicating they continue to remain aware of the global health situation and will make decisions accordingly as the convention gets closer. But it is still very far away at this point, and we really don't know what's going to happen over the next 4 months. So it continues to be all systems go for planning for STLV. John, are you excited about the appearance of Kelsey Grammer?
I am, and only because of a very selfish, selfish isn't the right word. It's a nice anecdote to my boredom sometimes of going into the main theater at STLV. As someone who's been in the convention-going crowd for a really long time, I gotta say, I started seeing some of these actors when I was 9 years old do their convention bit. And when I'm at STLV, sometimes I'll say, oh, it's actor so-and-so at the main theater. Do I really want to go see that person again for the 83rd time? And I think, maybe I'll just go hang out with my friends at the Masquerade, or maybe I'll just go to this thing that's, in the other theater, or see some other weird event or walk around the dealer's room. And so I felt like I'm paying for this seat in the theater and the main theater, and I don't really enjoy it all that much. And I know there are people who do, who like literally get in there at 10 o'clock in the morning and stay there till the thing shuts down every night. And, that's great if that's for them. But I'm really excited about the chance to go see someone new. And the nearest analog I can think of is when Kirstie Alley came to STLV a few years ago. I definitely was there, and I even got a photo op because I was a big fan of hers in Star Trek 2, of course. So it just made me very happy to have a new experience in the main theater, because I've heard all the stories from a lot of the favorites. It doesn't mean we don't love them, but it's after a while, we've heard it all. So I'm very excited to have a new thing to pull me into the main theater at the convention. Very excited to see that Creation is still working on getting these people that have even been tangentially involved in Star Trek, but there's an interest in the fans to see getting up there on the stage, and eager to hear his story and see what he has to say.
All right, well, we've talked about the facts, and now let's speculate on what's going to happen in the future of Star Trek.
You make some very good points, Captain. But it's still all speculation and theory.
So each week, I and my guest give you a wish or a theory we're nurturing about Picard, Discovery, Lower Decks, merchandise, future of the franchise. So John, let's hear your theory or wish for this week.
I have a wish for you, Alex, and it's something that I thought a lot about, and it's something that right in my Star Trek soul, I really wish this, and it's that going forward, if all Star Trek novels can be as tightly integrated and as beautifully intertwined with the show that we're seeing as was Star Trek Picard, The Last Best Hope. I felt like that novel really just hit it out of the park in that it wasn't, nothing was contravened from the show. They're literally the shoes on your feet. You go further with both of them than you do with either. It gives so much great backstory to Clancy and to the Romulan rescue. And I don't feel like I could even talk about Picard intelligently without having read that book now that I've read it. And it was just such a tight connection between the two. I really felt that there was a lot of Kirsten Beyer influence in the book itself. And while there's always been novels that have been sort of tied into the creative elements of the show that we've seen on TV, I felt that this one was really just right in there, and everything was right baked in, and there's through lines from the book right into the show. And I just loved every single thing about it. And I hope that they do more of that. That is my wish.
That is a great wish, and I 100% agree about the book itself. It has its hooks into at least the first 6 episodes of the season, in which, having read the book, obviously you don't have to have read the book in order to get the show or understand the show. But if you have read the book, it does add whole layers of meaning and understanding and appreciation for a lot of what you see on screen. And I think the thing that I was most impressed about The Last Best Hope was that they really were very, very careful to make sure that they were not giving you a book that was going to give big opportunities for it to be contradicted or for the show to go in a different direction. Despite being this massive story that has this amazing scale over such a big timeline, with the exception of a few original characters, it really is just focused on Picard and Raffi and Clancy and Elnor and the Coat Malat and a couple more. But, it's not like they didn't go down the road of going, oh, and over on Deep Space Nine, Kira was up to this, and after Voyager came back from the Alpha Quadrant, Admiral Janeway ended up doing XYZ in a way that, you could see a future story pulling in one of those characters and the writer's room deciding to do something very different. It felt like they were really carefully trying to think about how do you construct a story that the room's not going to go back to later and say, now we're going to redo this. Because they did that with Discovery. The first Discovery novel was about a meeting between Burnham and Spock, and a meeting between the Shenzhou and the Enterprise, and then the show decided they wanted to do the Enterprise and they wanted to do Spock, and they told a totally different story, and it didn't fit anymore at all with that original novel. That doesn't feel like that's going to be the case with Last Best Hope.
As an example of what we're talking about, for those of you who haven't read it, without giving really too much away, it goes back in time, and one of the scenes in the book is talking about Raffi actually having the discussion with her husband about choosing to go off with Picard on this Romulan rescue. And you read the full scene where the husband's like, "Hun, you have not been home in like 8 years. Our son barely knows who you are. I'm barely your husband anymore. This is literally, if you go off on this, don't come back." Right. And it's not quite as explicit as that, but it's very clear that he's putting an ultimatum, right? You have to choose between Picard or your family. She chooses Picard, and that does not work out well for her at all. And it really gave a whole nother layer to when you see how she's living next to the Vasquez Rocks in her little Star Trek future trailer, and you realize the depths that she's sunk to because based on reading the book, what had happened, and it gave a whole nother layer to the scene in which she goes to see her son on Freecloud. And you realize that she explicitly rejected them to say, "No, I'm going to go follow Picard," in the face of this ultimatum from the dad. And it just made everything a richer meal and much more satisfying. And I was really glad that when the book came out, I read it within like 3 or 4 days, because as soon as I could have read it, I read it before the next episode of Picard had come out. And I felt like that was the right decision for me.
So my theory this week is we have the season finale of Star Trek Picard coming up next week, and I will not be as bold as I was in Discovery Season 2 when I had some cockamamie theory. Well, I got right that Discovery was going to go into the far future, but I said that the original series Enterprise we were not going to see the bridge, and that we would actually see a future USS Enterprise, and of course that did not end up being correct. I'm not going to go that far, but what I will say is my theory is that there is a major, major, major surprise coming in that last episode, whether that is the appearance of a legacy character that has not been announced, that we don't know is coming into the show. There is a Starfleet task force that is, somewhere hanging around, because we found that out in Broken Pieces, that they were going to go to Deep Space 12, and presumably at some point that's going to become a relevant plot point again. I wonder who might be captain of one of those ships. Could the Enterprise be one of those ships? I don't necessarily think the Enterprise is going to show up right at the end of Season 1, just because I think that's repeating a plot beat from Star Trek Discovery Season 1 when the Enterprise appears in the final moments of the season, but I do think we're going to get something on par with the Enterprise appearing in the final moments of Discovery Season 1. That kind of wow, out of the box surprise moment that you never saw coming, that they did a good job of keeping under wraps, and that really is going to get the fan base fired up. John, do you think I'm right? And do you have any guesses about what it might be?
Well, I feel like the way that the writers have been going in this show, I think they've been subverting those obvious expectations so many times. And so, for instance, as we sit here and record this, right, the Zhat Vash were supposed to be these, evil Romulans, and it turns out, nope, they were actually pretty right as far as we could tell, right? They might be overzealous, but as far as we know, they're on the right side of things. Just, their methods leave a lot to be desired because Romulans. So it could be that they're setting us up for that, and then they pervert it or give us a twist on it in some unusual way, because it just seems like the show is written that way. For example, I certainly wasn't expecting when they got to the planet in this last episode for the Sims to be like, yeah, you know what we should do? Genocide against all the organics. That's a great idea. Let's begin with that, So it definitely was something that really surprised me. So just seeing the Federation show up in force makes me hesitant about that. And plus, I know that you have been following Mr. Shaban's Instagram Q&A. He made sort of a tongue-in-cheek comment about Noodle Trek and Falafel Trek.
Yes.
Where someone said exactly that. Like, aren't we going to see a giant Federation fleet? And he basically said, that's not this show. Or do I have it wrong, Alex? You can set me straight on that.
No. I mean, I think they have done a really good job of subverting your expectations. I think the only other thing I would say is that they have wanted to earn all of those moments that they got. They held off on a lot of the legacy characters until with the exception of the first appearance of Hugh, until you got to episode 5. The Riker Troy episode was episode 7. The first Engage was not until the 3rd episode. So it does feel like they are sort of parceling these pieces out as it goes, and maybe we will get something like that. I'm fixated on this idea that Q is going to show up at the end of this last episode.
Oh my.
Just because the show has so much been about the legacy of this character and the history of this character, and Q is such an integral part of that I don't know why. It doesn't necessarily feel like it fits with the tone of the show. I just have this feeling that Q is going to feature in it somehow. And I'm almost certainly wrong about that, but until the end credits roll, I will in the back of my mind be like, is Q about to show up?
I would be amazed if you're right. I am a big fan of John Delancey, and every time he's on the screen, I'm just incredibly happy. So I agree with you that he's a little bit too much Deus Ex Machina, and if he injects himself in the show, I think it'll be very dangerous from a storytelling perspective to have this magical character who can solve everything or ruin everything based on a whim. But man, I'd be happy to see John Delancey again as Q.
And I think that's what it is for me too. I'm just such a John Delancey fanboy. I love all of the Q episodes so much, and the idea of getting another scene between Patrick Stewart and John Delancey squaring off against each other in the way they did in TNG is just such a tantalizing prospect for me. I just can't quite let go of the idea that maybe it's not going to happen.
Yeah, we'll find out soon enough, my friend.
We certainly will. Do you have a theory or a wish for Discovery, Picard, or the future of the franchise that you'd like to share? Tweet them to me at WeeklyTrek, and I might feature your theory in a future episode. Well, that's all the time we've got for this episode of Weekly Trek. Thank you so much to my guest, John Krikorian, for joining me today. John, how can people contact you if they want to continue the conversation?
Absolutely. They can find me at TrekProfiles on Twitter, where I talk mostly about Star Trek, a little bit about fandom in general, and random LOLs. You can also listen to my podcast, Trek Profiles, where I interview Star Trek fans, and we celebrate their fandom and figure out why we love the show. So I'm Trek Profiles pretty much everywhere.
And have been interviewed by Star Trek fans from the most recent episode.
That's right. So this, as we record this, it's March 2020, and this is my 2-year podiversary. And so I decided to do something a little bit unusual. So it's Mirror Universe Day on Trek Profiles for the month. And what I did was I invited alumni of my show to come back and interview me about episodes of Star Trek that I thought were particularly powerful or meaningful. And so those interviews ran quite a bit longer than I had anticipated. I was thinking of doing just one episode, and it actually turned into 3 episodes. So part 1 has been released, part 2 will be released very shortly, and part 3 probably within a couple of weeks after that. So if you're interested in my take on my favorite episodes, look for my podiversary extravaganza wherever finer podcasts are sold.
And you can find this show on Twitter at WeeklyTrek and me at Alexander T. Perry. And if you enjoy the show, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast player of choice. And please check out some of the other great shows on the Tricorder Transmissions. And if you like our shows, please also consider becoming a Patreon of Tricorder, which you can find at patreon.com/the Tricorder Transmissions. And lastly, if you're looking for Star Trek news on the internet, I hope you will turn to trekcore.com. Well, thank you, John. Thank you to all of my listeners. And until next week, live long and prosper.